The moment I covered his camera, I knew I was either getting fired or changing something he had spent years building. The soft click of the lens adjusting followed me from room to room like a second heartbeat, steady, mechanical, always there, and by my third hour inside Adrian Volkov's house, I had stopped pretending not to notice it. The place didn't feel like a home. It felt like a system, walls lined with quiet eyes, ceilings hiding tiny red dots that blinked like they were breathing, watching, recording every step I took in my worn sneakers as I crossed polished marble floors that probably cost more than my entire apartment rent for a year. And I kept reminding myself why I was here, why I had said yes to a job that didn't feel right from the moment I walked in, because rent was due in 6 days, because my daughter needed new shoes, because sometimes survival doesn't ask if you're comfortable, it just asks if you're willing. So I signed the paperwork, nodded at the man in the suit who never smiled, and stepped into a world that wasn't meant for people like me. Lucas was sitting on the floor. When I first saw him, small, too quiet for a 7-year-old, surrounded by toys that looked untouched, like decorations instead of things meant for joy. And he didn't look up when I said his name, didn't react when I crouched a few feet away and softened my voice the way I always do with kids who carry something heavy behind their eyes. He just kept staring at nothing, like the world had already disappointed him too many times to try again. And for a second I forgot about the cameras, forgot about the job, because I recognized that look. I had seen it before in my own daughter the year her father left, that quiet kind of hurt that doesn't scream. It just settles in and stays, and I exhaled slowly, placing my bag down beside me, choosing my next move carefully, not for whoever was watching from behind those lenses, but for the boy sitting in front of me. Somewhere in the house, I heard a faint buzz, like a speaker coming to life, low and controlled, and even without seeing him, I knew he was there, Adrian Volkov. The man who owned this house, this system, this silence, the man who preferred distance over presence, control over connection, and I could almost feel his attention tighten as I reached for one of the toys on the floor, not asking permission, not waiting for instructions, just acting, because kids don't need perfect conditions, they need someone real, and if he was watching, then he was about to see something his cameras couldn't measure. I rolled the small wooden car gently toward Lucas, not too fast, not too slow, letting it stop, just within his reach. And for a moment nothing happened. The silence stretched, heavy, almost fragile, until finally, slowly, his fingers moved, barely, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to respond. And that's when I felt it, that shift, not in him, but in the air, like somewhere behind a screen. Someone leaned forward for the first time, paying attention, really paying attention, and I didn't look up at the cameras, not once. Because whatever this was, whatever this moment could become, it didn't belong to them. It belonged to the boy in front of me, and I was done performing for a system that didn't understand what it meant to care. Lucas did not speak, but he did not pull his hand away either, and somehow that felt louder than any words he could have said, his small fingers resting on the wooden car, like he was testing whether this moment was real or just another temporary thing that would disappear if he moved too quickly. And I stayed still, matching his pace, because trust does not come from rushing, it comes from staying. And I had learned that the hard way long before I ever stepped into this house. The soft hum from the ceiling shifted again, almost like a breath being held, and I knew he was still watching, calculating, analyzing every second like it was data instead of something fragile and human. And for the first time since I walked in, it irritated me, not because I was afraid of being watched, but because Lucas deserved more than being reduced to footage on a screen. I picked up another toy, a small plastic dinosaur with chipped paint, and placed it beside the car, moving it slowly across the floor, making a quiet, almost silly sound under my breath. Nothing dramatic, nothing forced, just enough to create space for him to step into if he wanted to. And after a few seconds, he did, barely noticeable, the corner of his mouth twitching like a memory of a smile he was not sure how to use anymore. And that was when I felt it again, that shift, heavier this time, like whoever was watching had not expected this, had not planned for something so simple to work. A faint click echoed through the room, followed by a voice, low, controlled, coming from somewhere I could not see. He does not respond well to unfamiliar routines. And there it was, the first direct intrusion, not a conversation, not a greeting, just a correction, like I was a variable that needed adjusting, and I closed my eyes for half a second, steadying myself, because I knew this moment mattered more than any paycheck, more than any instruction coming through hidden speakers. And when I opened them again, I did not look at the cameras. I did not acknowledge the voice. I stayed exactly where I was, focused on Lucas, because if I gave that system attention, it would take everything else from him. I rolled the car again, slower this time, letting it bump gently into his hand. And he looked at me, really looked at me for the first time, his eyes searching, cautious, like he was trying to understand why I was not reacting to the voice that clearly expected obedience. And I gave him a small nod, nothing dramatic, just a quiet reassurance that this space was his, not theirs. And something in his posture softened, just a little, enough to make my chest tighten in a way I was not prepared for. The voice did not come again, but the silence that followed was louder, heavier, like a test that had not gone according to plan, and I could almost picture him on the other side, watching monitors, waiting for me to correct myself, to follow instructions, to become part of the system he had built. But I did not. I stayed unpredictable, human, present, because that was the one thing his cameras could not control. Minutes passed like that, quiet, steady, until Lucas pushed the car back toward me, hesitant but intentional, and I let out a breath I did not realize I was holding, because that small movement meant more than any report or observation ever could. It meant he was still in there, still willing to reach back. And I wondered if Adrian Volkov understood what he was seeing, or if all he saw was a break in pattern, something to be fixed, something to be managed, because if he did not understand this moment, then he had built an entire world around his son without ever truly knowing him. And for the first time since I walked in, I realized something that made my pulse slow instead of race. I was not the one being evaluated here, he was. The first time I heard Lucas make a sound, it was so quiet I almost thought I imagined it. Just a small breath that carried something softer than silence. And I froze for a second, not moving, not reacting too fast, because moments like that can disappear if you reach for them too quickly. And I had learned that patience is not about waiting. It is about holding space without breaking it. The wooden car rested between us again, no longer a barrier, but a bridge, and his fingers traced its edge, like he was grounding himself in something real, something predictable, something that did not disappear when he looked away. And I kept my voice low when I finally spoke, not asking questions, not pushing, just letting the words exist near him instead of demanding anything in return. You can take your time, I said softly, more to the air than to him, because sometimes children hear you even when they do not answer. The house stayed quiet, but not empty, never empty, the faint presence of the system still pressing in from every angle. And I could feel it watching, measuring, waiting for something it could define, categorize, control. But what was happening here did not fit into neat categories. It was messy, slow, human, and I wondered if Adrian Volkov knew how to process something that could not be reduced to numbers on a screen. Another soft click echoed, and this time the voice came back, sharper, less patient. Encourage verbal response, it said, like a command written into code. And I felt something tighten in my chest, not fear, not exactly anger, something steadier, something that refused to bend. And I shook my head slightly, not toward the cameras, not toward the ceiling, just a small refusal that belonged to me, because Lucas was not a task to complete. He was a child learning how to exist again. I reached for a crayon from the small box on the table nearby, sliding it across the floor toward him, bright blue, simple, familiar, and I began to draw on a blank sheet of paper, slow lines, nothing complicated, just shapes that could become anything he wanted them to be, a house, a tree, a sky. And after a moment, his hand moved again, hesitant but real, picking up the crayon, pressing it to the paper with just enough force to leave a mark. And there it was, the smallest sound, barely more than a whisper, but undeniable this time. A single syllable that did not fully form into a word. And my heart skipped in a way I could not control, because it was not about the sound itself, it was about what it meant, that he was still trying. Somewhere above us, something shifted, like a chair being moved, like a tension sharpening into focus. And I knew he had heard it too, that for the first time, the system had captured something it could not explain. And I wondered what that looked like on his screens, if it felt like success or if it unsettled him. because it had not come from his instructions, it had not followed his rules. I leaned back slightly, giving Lucas more space, letting him own the moment instead of turning it into something for anyone else. And he glanced up at me again, longer this time, studying my face like he was searching for confirmation that this was safe, that this would not disappear. And I gave him a small smile, steady, real, something he could come back to if everything else felt uncertain. The voice did not return after that, but the silence changed. It was no longer heavy, no longer pressing. It felt uncertain, like something inside that house had been interrupted, like a system that had always worked suddenly did not have the right answer. And as I watched Lucas draw another uneven line on the paper, I realized something that made everything clearer. Adrian Volkov had built a world where nothing was left to chance, where every movement could be monitored, predicted, controlled. But the one thing he needed most, the one thing sitting right in front of me, was the one thing his cameras could never teach him how to create. The next time the system reacted, it was not with a voice, it was with control, subtle at first, almost polite. The lights in the room dimming just slightly, as if evening had arrived too early. The air conditioning shifting by a few degrees, cooler than before, calculated changes that most people would ignore, but I felt immediately, because I knew what it was, not comfort, not coincidence, it was a test. Lucas noticed it too, his hand pausing mid-motion above the paper, his shoulders tightening. Just enough to tell me that this place did not change without meaning. And I kept my expression calm even as my pulse picked up, because whoever was watching was not just observing anymore. He was adjusting, waiting to see how I would respond, whether I would look up, whether I would acknowledge him, whether I would fall into the rhythm he expected, and for a second, just a second, I considered playing along, making this easier, because it would have been simple to follow. Instructions, to align myself with the system instead of pushing against it. But then Lucas shifted closer to me, barely noticeable, a small movement that said everything, and I knew exactly what choice I had to make. I reached for the paper again, ignoring the change in temperature, ignoring the way the shadows in the room stretched a little longer than they should have, and I drew a simple sun in the corner of the page, bright, uneven, something that did not belong to this controlled environment, and I slid the paper slightly toward him, inviting but not demanding. And after a moment, he added to it, a crooked line that might have been a tree or just an attempt at one, and the tension in his shoulders eased by a fraction, enough to tell me that staying consistent mattered more than reacting to whatever was happening around us. A soft click sounded again, sharper this time, and then the voice returned, closer, clearer. You are deviating from the assigned structure, it said, calm but unmistakably firmer than before, and I let out a slow breath. Not because I was intimidated, but because I was done pretending this was normal, done pretending that raising a child could be reduced to a structure, and I spoke without looking up. My voice steady, controlled, but carrying something that had not been there before. He is not a structure, I said quietly, my eyes still on Lucas as he traced another uncertain line. He is a person, and the silence that followed felt different, not empty, not passive. It felt like impact. Like something had landed on the other side of those cameras in a way that could not be ignored. For a few seconds, nothing changed, no voice, no movement in the air, just the quiet sound of crayon against paper and Lucas breathing a little more evenly than before, and I almost thought that was it, that maybe he would pull back, retreat into the safety of distance. But then the door at the end of the hallway clicked, a real sound this time, not filtered through speakers or systems, and my chest tightened instinctively, not out of fear, but because something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. Footsteps followed, measured, unhurried, each one echoing softly against the marble floor, and I felt Lucas freeze beside me, his hand tightening around the crayon as if he already knew who it was before I even turned. And for the first time since I stepped into this house, the man behind the cameras was no longer behind anything. He was here, present, real, and somehow that felt more uncertain than anything the system had done, because control is predictable, but a person standing in the same room, watching without a screen between you, that is where things change. Adrian Volkov did not rush when he entered the room, and somehow that made his presence heavier, not lighter, each step deliberate, controlled, like he was used to walking into spaces that adjusted around him without question. and I felt it immediately. The shift in the air, the way the house itself seemed to recognize him. But I did not stand up. I did not move away from Lucas. Because if I changed now, if I broke the moment we had built, then everything we had just gained would disappear just as quickly as it came. Lucas's hand tightened around the crayon, his body going still in that quiet way children do when they are trying not to be noticed, and I placed my hand gently on the floor beside his, not touching him, not forcing anything, just close. Enough to remind him that he was not alone in this. And then I finally looked up. Adrian was exactly what I expected, and somehow more, tall, composed, wearing control like it was part of him rather than something he practiced, his expression unreadable, his eyes sharp in a way that made it clear he missed nothing, not the distance between me and his son, not the paper on the floor, not the fact that I had ignored every instruction he had given through those hidden speakers, and for a few seconds, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us, but it was not empty, it was measured, like he was deciding what I was worth in his world. You are not following protocol, he said finally, his voice calm, low, but carrying the kind of authority that most people would instinctively obey, and I felt the weight of it, the expectation behind it, but I did not lower my eyes, I did not apologize, because this was not about defiance, it was about something much simpler, something he did not seem to understand. He responded. I said quietly, nodding toward Lucas without breaking my tone, and that was when I saw it. Not a reaction exactly. More like a flicker, something small shifting behind his eyes as he looked down at the paper, at the uneven lines, at the crayon still clutched in Lucas's hand, and for the first time since he walked in, his attention moved away from me. He stepped closer, not too close, just enough to see clearly, and Lucas shrank slightly, his shoulders pulling inward, the fragile openness from earlier tightening again under the weight of his father's presence. And that was when I understood something I could not ignore. The system had not created that distance. It had only reinforced it. Adrian crouched slightly, not fully lowering himself, just enough to observe, and his voice softened by a fraction, almost imperceptible. Lucas, he said, as if testing the name out loud instead of through a speaker, and Lucas did not respond, his gaze fixed on the paper again, retreating into the quiet space he knew how to control, and the difference between before and now was immediate, sharp, undeniable. I exhaled slowly, choosing my next words carefully, because this was not about proving a point, it was about protecting what little progress had been made. You are watching him, I said, my voice steady but gentle. But he needs you to see him. And the room went still again, not tense, not hostile, just suspended, like something important had been placed in the center of it and neither of us could ignore it. Adrian did not respond right away, his gaze shifting from Lucas to me, measuring, reassessing, and for a moment, I wondered if I had gone too far, if this was where the job ended, where the door opened and I was escorted out of a world I was never meant to stay in. But instead, something unexpected happened. He straightened slowly, his expression unchanged, but his silence different now, less certain, less absolute, and as he turned slightly toward the door, pausing just long enough to say, "Continue," I realized that for the first time since I walked into that house, the system had not given the final instruction. He had, and it did not sound like control, it sounded like hesitation. The word lingered in the air long after he left, not loud, not commanding, just there, continue. And I realized how strange it felt that a man who controlled everything had just stepped back, even if only by an inch, and the moment the door clicked shut behind him, the house seemed to exhale, not fully, not freely, but enough for the pressure to shift. Lucas did not move right away, his eyes still fixed on the paper like he was waiting for something to be taken back, like he did not quite believe that the room belonged to him again. And I stayed exactly where I was, grounded, steady, because trust does not rebuild itself in silence. It rebuilds itself in consistency. I picked up the blue crayon again, drawing another slow line across the page, not looking at him directly, giving him space to return on his own terms, and after a few seconds, I felt it, that small shift beside me, his shoulder loosening, his grip on the crayon relaxing just enough to start moving again, hesitant. At first, then a little more certain, and I let out a quiet breath. Not relief exactly, more like recognition. Because this was fragile, and fragile things do not survive sudden movements. The cameras were still there. I could feel them, but something about them had changed. They no longer felt like control. They felt like observation without certainty, like whoever was behind them no longer had all the answers, and that made the room feel different in a way I could not fully explain. "You are doing fine," I said softly, not to push him, not to direct him, just to give the moment a voice that did not come from a speaker, and Lucas glanced at me again, quicker this time, less guarded, like he was starting to understand that I was not going to disappear the moment he looked away, and that mattered more than anything I could say. Minutes passed like that, quiet, steady, until he made another sound, clearer than before, not quite a word, but closer, shaped by intention instead of accident, and I felt something tighten in my chest, not because it was unexpected, but because it was earned, built piece by piece in a way no system could replicate. I did not react too strongly, did not celebrate, did not turn it into something overwhelming. I just nodded slightly, acknowledging it the way you acknowledge something real, something that belongs to the person who created it. And he held my gaze for a second longer than before, just enough to show me that he understood. Somewhere in the house, a faint sound echoed again, not a voice this time, just movement, distant, controlled, like someone pacing or shifting position, and I knew he was still there, still watching, but this time it felt different, less like surveillance and more like learning, hesitant, unfamiliar, like he was seeing something for the first time without knowing how to respond. I leaned back slightly, giving Lucas more space as he continued to draw, his lines still uneven but more confident now, and I let the silence settle naturally around us, not empty, not forced, just present, because that was the one thing this house had been missing before I walked in, presence without control. And as I watched him add another small shape to the paper, something that looked almost like a window, I realized something that made everything else fade for a second. Adrian Volkov had built an entire system to protect his son from the world, but in doing that, he had also protected him from something else, something quieter, something just as necessary, the simple, unpredictable, uncontrollable act of being understood. And for the first time since I stepped into that house, I was no longer just doing a job, I was changing something he did not even know was broken. It happened so fast that at first I thought it was just a shift in mood, a small crack in the rhythm we had built, but then Lucas's hand froze mid-motion again, not hesitant this time, not careful, frozen, like something inside him had pulled tight all at once, and I felt it immediately, that invisible wave that passes through a child before anything visible changes, the kind you only recognize if you have seen it before. His breathing changed first, shallow, uneven, his fingers pressing harder against the crayon until the tip snapped softly against the paper, and I turned toward him slowly, not rushing, not reacting too big, because panic feeds on reaction, and I could not afford to lose him now. "Hey, it is okay," I said quietly, keeping my voice low and steady, but his eyes were already drifting away from me, unfocused, like he was slipping somewhere I could not follow if I moved the wrong way. And I knew this was the moment, the one no system could predict correctly, the one that required presence, not protocol. The lights above flickered slightly, almost imperceptible, but enough to push him further, his shoulders curling inward, his small body folding into itself as if he was trying to disappear from something only he could see. And I did not think, I did not wait for instructions. I moved closer, slowly, carefully, lowering myself to his level until I was right beside him. Not touching yet, just close enough to anchor the space. Somewhere above us, I heard it. The faint click of a camera adjusting. Then another, sharper this time, like the system was reacting, trying to capture, trying to analyze, trying to regain control of something that was already slipping out of its reach. And for a split second, I glanced up, not in fear, but in clarity, because I understood exactly what was about to happen if I let it. Lucas would become a situation, a case, a problem to solve from a distance, and that would break him all over again. "No," I whispered under my breath, not to him, not exactly, but to everything watching, and I reached up. Without hesitation, my hand covering the nearest camera lens, blocking that small red light with my palm, and the effect was immediate, not in the room, but inside me, like I had stepped out of something artificial and into something real, The silence changed again, deeper this time, heavier, like the system had been cut off mid-sentence, and I turned back to Lucas, fully, completely, no longer aware of anything else except the boy in front of me, whose breathing was still uneven, whose hands were trembling slightly against the floor. "You are here," I said softly, finally placing my hand near his, not grabbing, not forcing, just present. "You are safe right now." And I repeated it, slower, steadier, matching my voice to the rhythm I wanted him to find. And for a few long seconds, nothing changed, the tension holding tight, refusing to break, until gradually, almost imperceptibly, his breathing began to shift. One deeper breath, then another, his shoulders lowering by a fraction, his grip loosening just enough for the crayon to roll away from his fingers. I stayed there, unmoving, patient, because this was not something you rushed, this was something you waded through. And as the room settled around us, quieter than it had ever been, I felt something else settle too. Something on the other side of that blocked lens, something that had just witnessed a moment it could not interrupt, could not control, could not even fully see anymore. And for the first time since I walked into that house, I knew without a doubt that whatever Adrian Volkov had built, whatever system he trusted more than people, I had just stepped outside of it, and there was no going back. For a moment, there was nothing, no sound from the system, no adjustment in the air, just my hand pressed against the cold surface of the lens and Lucas's uneven breathing slowly finding its way back to something steadier. And I stayed there, grounded in that silence, because I knew the second I pulled away, everything could rush back in. His fingers twitched slightly against the floor, then curled, then relaxed. And I matched my breathing to his without thinking, slower, deeper, giving him something consistent to follow, something real that did not come from a speaker or a screen. And after a few seconds, his shoulders dropped just enough for me to know he was coming back. Not all at once, but enough. "That is it," I whispered softly, not praising, not overwhelming, just anchoring the moment. And his eyes flickered toward me again, clearer now, still fragile but present. And I felt that quiet shift again, the one that mattered more than anything else in this house, the one that could not be measured or recorded. Then the door opened, not abruptly, not violently, just enough to break the stillness with something real, and I did not turn right away. I did not remove my hand from the camera, because I already knew who it was. I could feel it in the way the room changed, not colder, not louder, just heavier, like the air itself was paying attention. "Move your hand." Adrian's voice came, low, controlled, but different this time, not filtered, not distant, and I exhaled slowly, not in defiance, not exactly, but in certainty, because this moment did not belong to him, not yet. "No," I said quietly, my eyes still on Lucas, who was now watching both of us, his small world caught between two very different kinds of control. And for a second, nothing happened, no immediate reaction, no raised voice, just silence. And I knew that silence was not empty. It was calculation, restraint, something held back instead of enforced. "You cannot block my system," he said after a moment, and I could hear it now, not anger, not quite, but something unfamiliar beneath the control, something unsettled. And that was when I finally turned slightly, just enough to meet his eyes without removing my hand, without breaking the boundary I had created. "I am not blocking your system," I said, my voice steady, clear. "I am protecting your son." And the words landed in the room in a way I could not take back. Not sharp, not aggressive, just true. And I saw it then. That flicker again, stronger this time. Something shifting behind his expression that no amount of control could fully hide. Lucas shifted beside me, his hand moving slightly closer to mine on the floor, not touching, but choosing proximity, choosing presence over distance. And I knew he felt it too. The difference between being watched and being seen. Adrian did not step forward, did not force the moment back into his control. He just stood there, his gaze moving from me to Lucas, to the paper on the floor, to the crayon that had rolled away and now rested forgotten near the edge of the rug. And the silence stretched again, but it was no longer the same silence from before. It was heavier, more uncertain, like something inside him was trying to catch up to what had just happened without a system to guide it. Slowly, carefully, I lowered my hand from the camera, not as surrender, but as a choice. because the moment had already changed, because whatever needed to be seen had already been felt. And as the small red light blinked back to life behind me, I realized something that made everything else fall quiet for a second. Adrian Volkov had just witnessed something he could not command, could not predict, and for the first time, he had not stopped it. The room did not return to what it was before, even after the camera light blinked back on, even after my hand dropped to my side, because something had already shifted too far to be undone, and I could feel it in the way Lucas stayed where he was instead of pulling away, in the way his breathing remained steady instead of breaking again, in the way Adrian did not speak right away. He stood there, still, watching not through a lens this time, but with his own eyes, and there was a difference. Subtle but undeniable, like seeing something for the first time without distance to soften it. I turned slightly back toward Lucas, lowering myself fully to the floor again, choosing him, choosing the moment, because whatever conversation needed to happen with Adrian could wait, but this could not, and Lucas shifted closer without hesitation this time, his shoulder nearly touching mine, not seeking permission, not checking for approval, just choosing, and that small movement carried more weight than anything else that had happened in that house. "You are okay," I said quietly, not as reassurance this time, but as recognition, and he nodded, just barely, the smallest motion, but real, intentional, and I felt something inside me settle, because that was the point, not control, not perfection, just presence that stayed when things got hard. Behind us, Adrian finally moved, a single step forward, slower than before, less certain, and when he spoke, his voice was still controlled, still measured. But something in it had changed, something quieter. "What did you do?" he asked, not as a command, not as an accusation, but as a question he did not already know the answer to. And I glanced up at him for a moment, really looking this time, not at the authority, not at the control, but at the hesitation underneath it. "I stayed," I said simply, because there was nothing else to explain, no technique, no system, just something human that could not be programmed. And the silence that followed felt different again, not tense, not uncertain, just open, like something had been unlocked without either of us fully understanding how. Adrian's gaze shifted back to Lucas, watching the way he picked up the crayon again, the way his movements were no longer frozen, no longer guarded in the same way, and I saw it, that realization settling in, not all at once, not dramatically, but enough to change the way he was standing in that room. He took another step closer, then stopped, like he was unsure where the line was now, where control ended and something else began, and for a moment, neither of us said anything, because this was not something you rushed, not something you forced into clarity. Lucas glanced up at him then, just for a second, a brief connection, but it was there, and Adrian did not move, did not speak, did not interrupt it. And that was the moment everything changed, not loudly, not visibly, but in a way that mattered more than anything else, because for the first time, he was not watching from behind a system. He was standing in the same space, uncertain, present. I looked back at the paper, at the uneven lines that now looked less like mistakes and more like something being built, and I realized that whatever this house had been before, whatever rules had defined it, they did not hold the same weight anymore, not after this. Not after a moment that could not be recorded properly, could not be reduced to data, could not be controlled. And as Lucas drew another small shape beside the crooked sun, something that almost looked like a second figure standing next to the first, I understood something that made everything else fall quiet. Adrian Volkov had spent years making sure nothing in his world slipped out of his control, but the one thing that finally reached his son was the one thing he had never learned how to give, and now, for the first time, he was standing close enough to learn it.